All right, we're talking Lord of the Flies in this week's meeting of the Velshi Band Book Club. I'm joined now by Rutger Bregman, historian and author of 4 books, including Humankind, A Hopeful History. Rutger, nice to see you again. This is not a topic that you and I normally discuss, but I thought this would be an interesting approach to Lord of the Flies. Let's start with the fascinating and true story that you reported on after finding this article about these boys in Tonga, which you were looking for sort of a real-life example of what happens if a bunch of boys end up on a desert island, stuck there and having to make do for a while. Tell us what you found.
Well, look, if this story would have been a fictional Hollywood movie, people would say, this is so sentimental, this is naive, this is worse than Love Actually or whatever, right? This would never happen. But it's a real story. I remember reading Lord of the Flies when I was a kid, 16 years old, and feeling quite depressed afterwards. It was only later when I was doing the research for Humankind, my last book, that I thought, has it ever happened? Has there ever been a real case of real kids shipwrecking on a real island? And how would they behave? So that's why I started doing the research, and how I discovered that the real Lord of the Flies is in almost every single way the complete and total opposite of the novel.
Give us a little bit of a flavor of it. We've got a picture of it on the screen. The real example, people were more cooperative. They didn't devolve into their worst instincts, as Lord of the Flies implies would often happen.
Yeah. So the story starts with 6 Tongan kids. Tonga is an island group in the Pacific Ocean. And these kids, they're bored with school, right? They don't like school. They don't like their homework. They don't like the school meals. And they say, let's go on an adventure. And so they borrow a boat. They actually steal it. But they have this dream of going to Fiji or New Zealand or something like that. But what happens in the first night already is that they end up in a storm. Then they drift for 8 days, in their ship that's become a wreck. And then on the 8th day, they see land. It's a small island, a small volcanic island called Ata. And they manage to get on shore and somehow survive there for more than a year, for 50 months in total. And they do it by cooperating. I think it's really an example of what scientists call survival of the friendliest. So often in our evolution, actually, what has helped us to survive is cooperating, working together. That is the secret of our species, I think, if we're at our best, obviously. And that's really what this story shows.
I can give you a few examples of politics right now that work against that. But this book, Lord of the Flies, is it's pessimistic, right? You read it. It was pessimistic. A lot of people read it that way. Your book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, argues the exact opposite of that. Now, can you take the optimistic lens and then read Lord of the Flies and enjoy it or make sense of it?
Well, look, Lord of the Flies is still a great book, I think. I would highly recommend people to read it because it helps you to ask the big questions. What is human nature really like? Now, it gives a pretty depressing answer that I don't agree with, but these are questions we should all ask ourselves. What would I do in a situation like that when I'm on an uninhabited island? So I think it's an incredibly powerful novel, still for kids to read, for adults to read. I just think that kids also deserve to know about the one time in all of world history that we know of where real kids shipwrecked on a real island, because that's a very different story.
The author's daughter, William Golding's daughter, Judy Golding Carver, wrote a piece for The Guardian called What Lord of the Flies is Really About. And in it, she described her father, writing in part, "My father greatly distrusted simple judgments. He sought to examine the boy's reaction in the face of such obstacles. It is the removal of law and order that engenders the eventual savage responses." Now, this is interesting. The context here is interesting, right? So you are arguing that in fact, our nature is not savage and would be cooperative. And she's arguing that her father's point was when you remove structure and order, which is happening around the world in a lot of places, Rutger, that's what brings out our savagery.
So there's an old idea deeply embedded in our culture that says that our civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, and that below that lies raw human nature. This idea comes back again and again and again in our stories, in our philosophies, in our ideologies. And I think it justifies hierarchy and inequality. Because if we cannot trust each other, then we need the kings and the queens and the CEOs and the presidents and the Trumps, right? And the authoritarians, right? That is their justification for their power. And therefore, I think we should turn it around. If it is true that people by nature are actually cooperative and want to work together, then maybe we don't need to live in a society like the one we're living in right now that is so hierarchical, so unequal. And maybe we could actually move towards a much better kind of world. I completely recognize that that's pretty far from where we are right now. But my job as a historian is to basically open the windows and to show that things can actually be different because they've been different in the past as well.
So you mentioned kings and queens and Trump and all that kind of stuff. The title Lord of the Flies is actually another name for one of the 7 princes of hell, Beelzebub. He's a demon associated with pride and war, which are 2 things inherent to this book. Now, Rutger, you're an historian, but your father was a Protestant minister. You're no stranger to religious ideology. Is there a Christian commentary in the book?
Yeah, probably. I mean, my father was never he's still a preacher. He's not, the very strict conservative guy who says, oh, we are also sinful and therefore we need to just obey most of the time. There are different versions of religion, obviously. I think we always should judge ideas on what they actually do, how they make people behave, right? And what I worry about with the Lord of the Flies narrative is that when you become so pessimistic about people, when you become more cynical about people, that you become a little bit lazy as well, right? That you're like, oh, doesn't matter anyway. So what's the point of trying to change the world? So we don't have to be naive optimists, but we can be hopeful. And there's a form of Christianity that I was brought up with that is very much about that, actually about the power of hope.
Yeah. Rutger, this is a great conversation. I appreciate it. It's good to see you. Thank you for your analysis and your contribution to this. Rutger Bregman is an historian and the author of Humankind, A Hopeful History.